10 o'clock, we can start. Hello, everyone. I greet all of you from Washington, D.C. My name is Armando Al-Khouri. I'm the Vice Rector of the Merit Seminary in Washington, D.C. It's overwhelming and exciting to see so many joining us today, and I thank you for it. In the name of His Excellency Elias Zaidan, my bishop, and Robert Kitchen, the co-organizer, I welcome everyone to the first of 12 talks of the Year of Jacob of Serugh, an online series of lectures on the writings and theology of the Bishop of Batnan to celebrate the 1500th anniversary of his death. Heartfelt greetings also go to the audience joining us on Facebook, courtesy of Urho the Way, and on the eparchial YouTube channel. We are celebrating Jacob of Serugh because his theological and exegetical acumen has been influencing Christianity for over 15 centuries. All Christians, regardless of denomination, can benefit from his writings. I would like to thank His Excellency Elias Zaidan, the Eparchial Bishop of the Maryland Eparchy of Los Angeles, for sponsoring this online conference. My appreciation also goes to Aaron Butts, Robin Darling-Young, and Monica Blanchard for their support, encouragement, and valuable advice. In fact, we had planned on having an in-person conference, but they said because of the pandemic, what's going on all over the world, we should have an online series, and it was Aaron Butts' idea to spread it all over the year and have 12 lectures instead of a couple of days of intense lectures. Robert Kitchen, my co-organizer, has been indispensable in making this event a reality. Thank you, Robert, for your support. I look forward to our next project. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to share with you the logistics of managing this talk. You have already noticed that you are muted and cannot unmute yourself unless I request that you do so. You may address your questions to today's speaker only at the end of the lecture. First, you need to raise your virtual hand. To do so, click on the participants icon under the video feed. The right side of the Zoom window expands and a list of names of participants is displayed. Move your cursor over to your name and select Raise Hand. I will call on you in the order I see on my screen, and I will request that you unmute yourself. Once unmuted, you may ask your question. Obviously, everything is not going to go smoothly, so just bear with us as we navigate this new way of meeting. Our speaker today, Sebastian Brock, is no stranger to many of us. He is one of the most prominent scholars in Syriac studies. He is known as the Malfono de Malfoni, teacher of teachers, or the scholar among scholars. This world-renowned scholar studied at the University of Cambridge, where he completed his BA in classics and Oriental languages. He became a doctor of philosophy at Oxford in 1966 and taught at the University of Birmingham and then at Cambridge University. He spent most of his academic career at Oxford University from 1974 until his retirement in 2003. Since 2003, he is Emeritus Reader in Syriac Studies and Emeritus Fellow of Walton College, Oxford. Sebastian Brock is married to Helen Hughes Brock. If I were to list his writings, it would take me more than the allotted time. It is, however, worthwhile mentioning The Luminous Eye, the spiritual vision of St. Ephrem the Syrian, the Syriac Fathers on Prayer and the Spiritual Life, and Jacob of Serugh's verse homily on Tamar. How did Sebastian Brock get into Syriac studies? He actually wanted to study Septuagint, but was introduced to the Syriac world early on in his academic journey. He traveled with his distant Lebanese cousins to Lebanon, where he discovered for the first time the Syriac communities. When he returned to his homeland, the United Kingdom, he started reading Syriac manuscripts at the University of Birmingham. The Syriac world fascinated him so much that he has spent his life studying and publishing about it. It is exciting to have Sebastian as our first speaker of the year. We thank you, Sebastian, for agreeing to present your paper on why should we be celebrating Jacob of Serugh. Without further ado, let us give a warm online welcome to the Malfono d Malfone, Sebastian Brock.
Well, thank you very much, Armando, and greetings to your excellencies, Mar Elias, Mar Polycarpos, Mar Gregorios. It's wonderful to see so many friends. What I thought I would do for this first lecture in the series is to give 7 possible reasons why we should have the series in the first place. In some ways, I should probably anticipate things that future speakers will be talking about, so you can treat this as a sort of trailer. So first of all, the question, why should we commemorate in the first place? Jacob of Serugh is a little known name for most people, and he happened to end up in old age as a bishop of a very small market town in southeast Turkey. And we don't even know very much about his life. But what is left is a large corpus of writings, mostly homilies in verse. Well, initially that doesn't sound all that promising, especially as the verse homilies that many of us have read from much later periods are not terribly interesting. But what he has achieved in a remarkable way is he's a saint in 2 different churches, one Chalcedonian and the other non-Chalcedonian. And yet he was living at a time of bitter controversy between these 2 parties. So he's a saint in 2 rival churches, a remarkable achievement, Syrian Orthodox and Maronite. And the controversy was, of course, about the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and Jacob must have been born roughly at about that time. And as anyone who's living in America knows, when things get polarized, it's very difficult not to be pushed one side or the other. Jacob preferred a third way and not a question of either or. And he was, from his correspondence, we know he was pressurized by monks of one particular monastery to commit himself to one side or the other. And his gentle reply reveals his true theological position and what theological positions he dislikes. But in his public writings, he retains, as it were, neutrality and follows this third way, which on other occasions I call the way of silence, rather like Pseudo-Dionysius, who was more or less a contemporary, well, probably was a contemporary, but we don't know which side he belonged to either. Because in his writings, he does not display his feelings, theological position, they are accepted on both sides. And so we have his homilies transmitted in Syrian Orthodox, of course, and in Melkite, Maronite manuscripts, and highly appreciated on all those sides. What is important to realize is that he was very much aware of what was going on, but he disliked the approach, the analytic approach of the current theological mode of discussion. And so he prefers this different way of both silence and also, one could say, of wonder. So that's the first reason. Now, it's worth trying to place Jacob within a wider span of Syriac literature, and I'll only deal with the very early period of Syriac literature up to, say, the 6th century. So that's basically the 4th to 6th century. Now, Jacob's reputation within these churches is based very largely on his writings and above all his poetry. So it's important to know what he wrote. The poetry for which he is most famous are the Mimre, the 12-syllable couplets, and we have over 350 of these. And 160 were recently added to the number of published ones by Roger Achras and his associate Imad Suriani in Damascus. And before that, we had Paul Bejan's wonderful collection in 5 volumes, and a few scattered elsewhere. So that is basically the source of his reputation, these wonderful homilies, and I'll say a bit more about them shortly. He doesn't only write homilies, verse homilies in Mimre form. He also wrote quite a number of madrashe and of sugyatha, madrashe sugyatha, if you like. And about 25 of these madrashe which survive, and I'm trying to edit them at the moment. They're very nice, but I don't think they're quite on the par with the Mimre, and they deal with rather different subjects. Both these genres, Mimre and madrashe, Jacob inherited from his predecessors, in fact, basically from Ephrem in the 4th century. And Ephrem was an amazing poet who clearly himself inherited a very well developed poetic tradition. And the number of kole, stanza structures that Ephrem makes use of is quite astonishing, over 50. So that's in the madrashe form. In the Mimre form, he developed what is known as the meter St. Ephrem, 7 + 7 syllables, and Jacob is said to be the innovator of the different 12 + 12 syllables, and in between you have balai with 5 + 5 syllables. And so if you ever come across a liturgical manuscript, you'll find lots of poems saying in the meter, Ma Ephrem, Ma balai, Ma Jacob. Now, in the 5th, 6th century, we have a completely new phenomenon within the early Christian world of the verse homily. If you turn to the Greek or Latin sources, all you will find are prose homilies, and that's in fact what we expect today. We simply do not expect the preachers to be preaching in verse. But for some reason, and how this started off, we don't know, the 5th, 6th century produced quite a number of these verse homilies. And they do seem to have been used, or at least some of them being used liturgically, and if not liturgically, in a paraliturgical setting. And certainly later on, they're used in liturgical settings, because we've actually got liturgical manuscripts which incorporate them. And this is a quite remarkable development. And in the case of Jacob himself, it rather looks as if he's got an element of oral poetry composition in him, because he works by blocks of 4-syllable blocks. And if you read a lot of his poetry, you'll notice that there are a great many of these 4-syllable blocks which turn up on all sorts of occasions. So in a way, it's a bit like Homeric verse, which is thought to have been composed in a similar sort of way. How he actually did it and performed it, we simply don't know. And we don't even know whether he just read out his poetry or chanted it or sang. So all these are questions which are completely unknown. Now, he also wrote a number of prose works. The most extensive are his correspondence, and we've got quite a lot of that. And I mentioned that his correspondence with the monks of Marbassos, who wanted to pressure him into taking sides. But these were private correspondence, and so didn't reach the wider public. But what did reach the wider public are 6 prose homilies on major feasts. And these seem to have been very popular at the time. We have a number of early manuscripts, but then they drop out. And this is completely in contrast to what happens to the Mimre. And I'll say something about the way his Mimre were transmitted later on. So turning to what he actually wrote, he is best known as a highly imaginative and creative representer of the biblical narratives. And the great majority of his Mimre are in fact on biblical topics. The main exception is a certain number of them on saints. He has a wonderful approach to the biblical text, and what he says is just as applicable today. And he says you must approach it in the right mood. If you approach it in a critical mood, it's going to tell you one thing. If you approach it in a mood of, as he says, love, then it's going to respond with love. There's a nice passage in one of his poems, which is worth reading to you. Here he's actually getting the biblical text to speak to the audience, the congregation. And he says, Scripture says to you, if you do not read me, if you read me reluctantly, I too will be reluctant to reveal to you my true meaning. Either love your fellow human beings and then open me and read and see my beauties, or don't read me, for you won't get any benefit if you don't love me. To the person who shows love to me as they read me, I will show love. And if they ask me, I will give over to them all my treasures. So Jacob's treating the biblical text not as an object, but as it were, a companion with which you're dialoguing, which is quite a helpful way of thinking of how to read the biblical text. And as a preparation for his Mimre, very often, and this is the normal pattern, he will have an initial invocation to the Holy Spirit, asking for inspiration. And I'll read you one of these, just the first few verses, since it's a particularly nice one. He was known as the lyre of the Spirit, or harp of the Spirit, depends how you translate it. And this turns up in this invocation. This is the invocation to one of his several homilies on Elisha. And he says, "Wake up, my lyre, and sing out praise to the sun, discerningly and richly with sounds full of love." You see the emphasis on love. "Wake yourself, O spiritual harp, to play rich sounds for the one who plucks you. Wake up and sing with the 10 speech-endowed strings that have been woven into you by grace for the singing of praise. O eloquent harp that the maker of all has made, sound out from within yourself and sing out praise with new sounds. Sing praise openly with the 5 physical senses, then sing internally with the 5 spiritual senses." One thing that marks many of these Mimre on biblical subjects is the use that Jacob makes of invented speeches. And this is one of the main characteristics of this type of verse homily. You'll find the same thing in Narsai, who is an elder contemporary, and elsewhere. And these liven up these verse sermons in a wonderful way. And the speeches may be between the individual biblical characters. Sometimes the sort of hint that there existed is actually in the biblical text, but very often Jacob interposes speeches to the different biblical characters where they are not indicated in the biblical text. He also speaks himself directly to the biblical characters, asking them questions and getting them to answer him. And he also speaks to his audience every now and then to make sure they're listening. And every now and then I found a passage where he says, "Where have we got to? Can you tell me? Were you really listening?" So evidently there were breaks, coffee breaks in between the sermon. Now, what he does to bring out the spiritual meaning of the biblical passages is to use a typology to a great deal, a great extent, typology linking the Old Testament, New Testament, the two testaments with his contemporaries, with himself, and with the eschaton. So it's a way of providing a spider's web of interconnections between the biblical text, the contemporary reader, and place in the whole of salvation history. So it's interlinking, showing the interlinked nature of the spiritual world. And along with this typology, now I'll give you an example of it in a minute, he has abundant imagery. He uses letter imagery a great deal. You'll find Joshua in the Old Testament writing a letter to Caleb. Pilate's wife communicates by letter to Pilate, so it's rather like using email between different rooms in the same house. And Mary, of course, receives a letter at the Annunciation, and indeed, elsewhere in Jacob, she is a sealed letter herself. So that's one of the rather, well, to us today, perhaps a bit bizarre pieces of imagery, but it's used very effectively by Jacob. He uses mirror imagery, great deal of bridal imagery, and this comes out especially in connection with typology. And that, as one can see that in the passage I will read, if I can find the place. This is on the verse in John's Gospel, chapter 19, verse 34, which is the stepping point for a huge amount of exegetical developments in Syriac, usually of a typological character, as you'll see in this passage. Christ slept on the cross, and baptism came forth from him. The bridegroom slept, and his side was pierced in his sleep. He gave birth to the bride, as happened to Eve in Adam, his type. The stillness of the sleep of death fell upon him on the cross, and from him came forth the mother who gives birth to all spiritual beings. The Lord of Adam produced the new Eve in his sleep to serve as mother of the children of Adam in Eve's place. Water and blood for the fashioning of spiritual babes flowed from the side of that living one who died in order to bring life to Adam. That dead one who was alive showed forth a marvel after his death. There flowed from him blood to indicate that he was alive. There flowed forth from him water to indicate that he was dead. The blood flowed too to teach that he was alive, though dead. So that's extremely packed with typology, and I won't spend time unpacking it for you. I'll leave you to do that yourselves. But that is very typical of his approach to a biblical text. Now, in these Mimre, he also produces wonderful little scenarios. Just to give you one example, Cain and Abel. He has a whole series of Mimre on Cain and Abel. And at one point, Cain accuses God of favoritism. Why has Cain's sacrifice been rejected and Abel's accepted? This is a question that all sorts of exegetes in antiquity, Jewish, Christian, asked, and many different answers. And Cain goes on and said, I haven't been paid to look after Abel. So justice is ordered to intervene and investigate the matter. And justice talks gently to Cain and gives him another chance to repent, but Cain replies angrily, and I quote directly, like a patient who doesn't want to show his wound to the doctor. Now, of course, the reference to the doctor as the healer of sin, forgiver of sin, takes one back to Aphrahart's demonstration number 7 and the great prominence of medical imagery in the Syriac tradition as a whole. Now, before I go on to look at the way Jacob treats biblical women, which is particularly interesting, just a word or two about asking the question whether he was known outside the Syriac-speaking world. He was already very famous as a poet in his own day, and he actually features in a contemporary chronicle. You don't often have a preacher turning up in a historical text. So that's the indication of how he clearly made a great reputation. Now, turning outside beyond the Syriac world, one has to remember that in the 4th and 5th century, Syriac poetry, thanks to Ephrem largely, had a very high prestige, which crossed the linguistic boundaries. Syriac poetry was translated into Greek, and what one needs to remember, and especially in monoglot countries like England and North America, many people in late antique Syria were bilingual. Now, the one candidate in the Greek world who quite possibly does seem to have read or known of Jacob's poetry and his Mimre was the Greek poet Romanos, who is a younger contemporary. Romanos actually came from Syria, from Homs, and spent most of his rest of his life actually in Constantinople. But Romanos's Kontakia, these stanzaic poems, the verse form, Greek scholars are generally agreed that there is some sort of Syriac background to the verse form, but what's important for us is, did Romanos himself, was he bilingual? Was he bicultural? Could he read Syriac? Had he listened to any of these sermons? And in recent years, a few scholars have been investigating this with some very interesting results, and maybe I hope we'll hear some more about this later on in the series. Earlier scholars had actually claimed that Romanos was influenced by the earlier poet Ephrem, and that is now seen to be a bit less likely. And so Romanos, Jacob seems to be a better candidate. It's actually a very fascinating task to compare the way that Romanos and Jacob, and indeed Narsai in the East Syriac tradition, deal with exactly the same biblical topic. And we've got quite a number of occasions or feasts, biblical feasts, where we've got poems by all three. So there's plenty of material to work on in that respect. Let me turn briefly to biblical women. Jacob, in many ways, is an heir to Ephrem. If you've got an exegetical passage hinted at, or the explanation to a biblical problem in Ephrem, which is explained by Ephrem in rather cryptic tones, you need to turn to Jacob, who will explain it in a rather more direct fashion. So Jacob is a very good exegete for Ephrem's rather obscure biblical allusions sometimes. And I'll give you an example of that very shortly. But he also inherited from Ephrem a clear empathy for biblical women. And this is evident in quite a number of his memory, which involve biblical women. And it's interesting that Jacob, in his poem on Ephrem, should spend quite a lot of time at the end of the poem speaking about Ephrem initiating women's choirs, which is something that has caught on in the modern world too, with modern Syrian Orthodox and other choirs, often named after Ephrem. So Jacob inherits something of this empathy that Ephrem clearly had for women. The passages I wanted to read for you, one comes from a remarkable homily which Armando actually mentioned on Tamar. This is Genesis 38. There are two Tamars in the Old Testament. This is the one in 38. And it's the passage where she appears to seduce Judah, her father-in-law. So it's really rather a shocking passage. But it was treated by Jacob in an amazing homily, where she comes out not only justified, but as a model for the church to follow. Now, the hint for the way Jacob takes it is already found several passages in Ephrem, one of which says as follows. This is in one of the nativity hymns. Since the king, that's Christ, was hidden in Judah, Tamar stole him from his loins. Today this king has shone forth, and the splendor of the beauty of his beauty has been, which is the splendor of the beauty had been loved by her in its hidden form. So what Tamar is doing, she has fallen in love with the seed of the Messiah. She wants to belong truly to the messianic genealogy. And if you look in the gospel genealogies, you'll see that she's there for, in Matthew, but not in Luke. So I'll just read you a short passage just to look at how Tamar deals with this. In the case of the all mystery-filled, sorry, I can't see this, my eyes are clouded up. In the case of all the mystery-filled narratives of the only begotten, it is right to listen with great love, O discerning reader, for if love does not open the gate of your ear, then there is no passage to your hearing for the words. So the same emphasis on the right approach. And then he explains what Tamar is doing. Therefore now listen in a discerning way concerning Tamar. Look at the radiant woman filled with all the beauty of faith. So it's her faith in the messianic seed. This woman entered Judah's household and she became a daughter-in-law. while faith in the house of Abraham was burning within her. She took pride in the blessed seed of the great race and held in expectation that from her the Messiah would shine forth when he came. But of course, the family of Judah prevent this from happening. They make promises, but nothing happens. So that she has to resort to this very unconventional ruse of seducing Judah. And just one more short passage. Now, because God's providence was involved in that affair, Judah wasn't able to win. Tamar's prayer and her intention, so full of beauty, caused the heart of that upright man to turn aside to the prostitute. God saw how much she was longing for the epiphany of his son, and because she was worthy, he granted her to find what she wanted. Her heart rejoiced at intercourse with the upright man, for she had snatched wealth from the merchant, and then he passed on. So quite a dramatic way of treating that episode, but I do urge you to read the whole poem. Just a teeny bit doesn't really tell you all that much. Now, the other woman I'd like to briefly draw your attention to is the woman with a flux of blood. In Syriac, she's called the afflicted woman. And she, in the Memra devoted to her, she actually invites from, as it were, the New Testament text, Jacob to tell her story. And he does so with an amazing delicacy for her feelings and a great empathy for her. The way he describes how her suffering, at one point she addresses her disease, her suffering, her illness directly and curses it. And then finally she plucks up her courage and she hearing of Jesus's reputation as a healer, and she goes terrified that she'll be recognized because of course she's unclean and so she wouldn't be accepted. But nevertheless, she goes ahead, she prays in secret to Christ, and the passage I will read is just after her prayer to Christ. She is crept up incognito in the crowd and prays in secret to Christ. And now I quote, "Then our Lord in secret heard the woman brought low, and he made his steps short and small for her sake. She spoke in herself, while Christ heard her in secret. For hidden prayer is more beloved by him than presence. He held himself back for her surreptitiously to take from him what she wanted. He stopped so that she might reach him without her becoming faint, for she was very weak. He had pity on her low estate and her misery, for she was feeble. In secret, he extended to her the hem of his garment to meet her expectation. She put forth her hand to his outer garment, and his power visited her. The importunate fountain of blood was stopped from her limbs. In secret, power went forth and visited the sick woman, making her healthy." So just a couple of snippets from these 2 verse homilies, and many others one could quote for. But I hope that encourages you to read Jacob for himself. Now I see time has run on. I'm very bad at keeping time. I should have got an alarm clock to ring. I'll just quickly say something about his reception. He had huge popularity in his own lifetime. We have an enormous number of manuscripts of his poems from all periods. Now that is quite exceptional for any Syriac author. The only one who rivals him is, rather curiously, Bar Hebres's verse grammar, which again has a huge number of manuscripts. But I counted up something like 345 manuscripts which have poems by Jacob. And some of these are huge, great collections from the 10th, 11th century, 12th century. In Damascus, I remember handling, or barely handling, because they weighed so heavy, huge, great manuscripts, which had over 200 mimre in. So very popular, that's in Syrian Orthodox tradition, of course, but also in the Melkite tradition, we have quite a number of manuscripts. The Melkite tradition and the Maronite tradition, quite a number of manuscripts of Jacob's homilies. And it's important to remember that for the Melkite tradition, Syriac was a very important both literary and liturgical language for quite a long time, certainly till the 12th, 13th century. And in some of the manuscripts, Melkite liturgical manuscripts and St. Catherine's, we do have examples of liturgical manuscripts where Jacob is used at great length in some of the services, especially for Lent and Holy Week. Jacob also has 3 anaphoras attributed to him. But whether the attribution is correct, of course, is doubtful. Actually, a bit more likely are the 2 baptismal services. The standard Maronite baptismal service is attributed to Jacob, and indeed, its very beautiful language is full of phraseology which could easily come straight out of Jacob's homilies. Very recently, from St. Catherine's Monastery, a new Syriac baptismal text has turned up, and again attributed to Jacob, but it's totally different from the Maronite one. And in the next number of Orientale Christiana Periodica, there'll be an edition of it. A very interesting text. Now, the one area where it doesn't seem Jacob had any popularity, and perhaps for obvious reasons, is the Church of the East. But there is, very surprisingly, a quotation, quite a long quotation, from one of his prose Torgomi in the Church of the East Hudra, that's the liturgical hymnary. Very surprising for the Feast of the Resurrection. So the Church of the East, he doesn't seem to be read very much, or hardly at all. In translations, we've got quite a number of translations: Armenian, Arabic, and thence into Ethiopic and into Georgian. Very recently, a very nice homily on the Nativity was published by a Georgian scholar. My last reason, and this will be very quick, is basically sheer enjoyment and the readability of Jacob. That's a very good reason for commemorating him and reading him. He has, for the most part, a very straightforward style in his mimre, and he rarely causes any real difficulty. So even for comparative beginners in Syriac, he is a very rewarding text to read. And this in contrast to Ephrem, whose beautiful poetry is often exceedingly difficult to read, or to fully appreciate anyhow. Now, fortunately, Jacob is beginning to become a bit more available. I mentioned at the beginning, we now have 160 new mimre, so a lot more to work on. But in translation, the Gorgias Press took the initiative of having a series of bilingual texts, the metrical homilies of Mark Jacob of Serugh, and I think about 40 homilies covered by that by now, maybe a bit more. And Armando says he's going to start up a series for a purely non-academic readership. That's really excellent. And there's a very nice volume of the invocations at the beginning of selection of these invocations by Mary Hansbury, published very recently by a local convent, actually, in Oxford, the Fairacres Press. I will end simply by quoting a few lines of Jacob. He's actually writing on Ephrem, but it applies just as much to him. So with these lines of Jacob, you can apply them to Jacob, even though he's the author. A harpist of the house of God, who in measured lines enclosed his verses to make a joyful sound with great wonder. A son of the apostles, who possessed with them the word of truth that cannot be uprooted by all the false winds. A sea of homilies, in which, behold, all preachers sail without fathoming its depth and the extent of its abundance. So I think that applies to Jacob just as Jacob applies it to, to Ephrem. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much for this beautiful talk. I'm going to start with a quick question. You refer to the hemorrhaging woman as the afflicted woman, and it doesn't talk about her, the term afflicted woman doesn't talk about her physical state, but about her emotional state. And I think that I find that fascinating, that she's afflicted because of physical state, but it also says something about how she feels from the inside. I wonder if this terminology is something Syriac in general, it just happened to be for this lady, for this woman.
Oh no, I think that it's general, that you'll find that especially in Jacob, but also in Ephrem, there are, as it were, two levels of reading him. One, you can read a surface level, it's rather like reading the biblical text. You've got a surface text, a surface meaning, and as it were, an interior meaning. And I think that's the case. Jacob brings this out in many of his poems, likewise Ephrem. And so he's drawing attention to the physical side of it, and he does devote quite a number of, quite a large portion of that poem to her disability and all the trouble she's had with it, and there she's addressing the illness itself, cursing it in a quite descriptive narrative. It could be of interest to medical historians even. But of course, Jacob is more interested in bringing out what her faith in persevering, rather like the sinful woman in Luke 7, on which he also has a wonderful homily. She is, as it were, very daring in what she's doing. She might well get repulsed very early on. She's just heard about this faith healer by reputation. She says she has great faith, and this is what Jacob is trying to emphasize throughout. So it's the difficulties that she has to face that he brings out.
Thank you. If anyone has a question, please move your cursor over your name and raise your virtual hand, and I'll ask you to unmute yourself. Let me figure out. I have two people raise their hands. Here you are. Okay. Father Michael Shemi.
Thank you very much, Malfone Malfone. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak. I was privileged with hearing your talk 2 years ago, I think it was, in New Jersey, where you specifically addressed the baptismal text attributed to Jacob of Serugh. And I was wondering, and I'm very happy to hear about the upcoming publication as well. I was wondering if you could say if there are any other texts that are attributed to Jacob of Serugh and likely written by him in liturgical use, besides, of course, the numerous Borotho in the Syriac liturgy, which are excerpts from his Mimre. And then second part to that question would be, what are the elements, especially in prose works, that would suggest to us that it's authentically Jacob of Serugh?
For the first question, besides the Boer Wuthel, several of which one can actually identify the source in the homilies. There are, in the early collection of homilies, the homiliaries, a genre which stopped being copied at a certain point in history, you'll find a lot of Jacob's verses, his Mimre incorporated, and this applies both in Melkite and Maronite and in Syrian Orthodox. But this literary genre of having, as it were, an anthology of homilies for, as it were, recycling use, seems to have dropped out at a certain point. So it's primarily in the Boer Wuthel that you have bits of Jacob here and there. And of course, there are some of his, now I come to think of it, the one or two of his Madroshe, from which we have stanzas in the liturgical poetry, incorporated in the Kole and Madroshe, in the Fenkitho. So that's the sort of place you have to look, but you wouldn't get a whole poem. And what happened in these texts, they're sort of anthologized. You have a few couplets taken out and often put in a different context. So it's a bit disappointing if you're looking for genuine Jacob. Your second question, remind me.
It was, what would be the textual elements we would look for, especially in prose works?
Oh, in prose, yeah. Well, this is a very subjective thing, I think. The general feel. In the prose homilies, they're actually transmitted in very early manuscripts. So if you've got a very early attribution, the high likelihood is that it's a correct attribution. So I think one can be fairly certain that these Torgome are genuinely by him. But you'll find a lot of phraseology that he uses, especially in the more poetic, that he uses sort of style of prose poetry, rather like Arabic Sajj or Greek Kunstprosa. And so it's the sort of phraseology, the images that he uses, it's often very similar. So I think that is how a best answer to give.
Thank you very much.
Stephen?
Hello. Very nice to listen to you, Sebastian, and to see you so well. And Professor Brock, very good to listen to your talk on Jacob of Serugh. Two questions, both literary. The first one is, you mentioned that you're editing the Madrashe of Jacob, and I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about where that will appear. So that was question one. And the question two,
sorry, I don't yet know.
Oh.
My idea is perhaps a more academic one in CSCO, if they accept it, and a less academic one by some church publication, maybe Yes Press, but I don't know. It's not all that far, not far enough developed at the moment.
Oh, it could be some time.
Certainly,
Yeah, okay.
A few years.
The second question is a much older one, much older publication. You published the Torgame in 1984, and I wondered whether you now think that they were by Jacob, and they haven't featured so far in your talk. And I just wondered if you could say a few words on.
Yes, I did in fact mention them. I do think they're genuine. The only reason I didn't go any further with them is that Frederick Rie published them almost the same time with the French translation. So given that most Syriac scholars, if they really want to read them, can cope with French, or so I haven't done anything further on them. But it was from one of those that we do have this passage in the East Syriac Hudra, for Easter, which is quite a big chunk. It's about half a page in the Hudra, which is, that's very, as you probably know, it's very thickly printed.
Mm. And that's the one for Easter.
They're very fine, but they've had very little attention paid to them.
Yeah, I've read them recently, and I was quite impressed with them. Thank you for answering my questions.
Well, thank you. Nice to see you again.
Yes, it's been a few years.
Quite a number.
Susan?
First, thank you so much, Sebastian, for this wonderful feast of a talk you've given us this morning. And I'm wondering if you could, or if you know of cues perhaps in the manuscript witnesses, if you can say anything to us about the performance of Jacob's very long homilies. You know, some of these are so long that it's difficult to imagine them being presented on one occasion. And I'm wondering if you think he might have I'm thinking of like the first homily for the Feast of the Nativity, or the very long homily on the 6 days of creation. I'm wondering if you think they could have been performed over multiple evenings, perhaps, or multiple services, or whether you think they could have been punctuated with litanies, you know, just kind of a break in the, because they have very clear sections.
Yes. In the case of the 6 days of creation, I guess they probably were on separate days. But the other ones, I'm just not sure. The one or two homilies where he actually mentions that he's made a break and he's picking up again, and whether these were short breaks, as I suggested, coffee breaks in the modern context, or whether we simply don't know. This is the trouble. And I suspect that people in the Middle East, and this is still true, and I've sat through it, are happy to hear people go on and on and on. And if you think of, also in India, I've heard, in fact, a friend of mine speak for 3 hours on end, and people, their attention doesn't drop. I once asked Bishop Metropolitan Gregorius, the famous Metropolitan who I got to know quite well, and I said, how on earth do you do it? I couldn't possibly do it. And he said, well, you say the same thing over again and again in different ways. And I guess that's it. But Jacob, of course, is not actually saying the same thing over in different ways. Though I noticed I was going through Ephrem and Narsai again the other day, and I did notice that the break comes, he's done the narrative, as it were, representing a narrative, then he's going to do the commentary, and there's a break comes there. So it's a natural break, and I guess he'd actually designed it as such, but he inserts the mention of it actually in the course of the homily. He doesn't often do this, but it does suggest that there were these breaks, and I suspect this was all produced on the same day and same afternoon or same morning, but people got up, wandered around, stretched their legs. And I think you have to think of something much more informal than what we are used to, that we would expect. So I think these two things, the informality and the ability of congregations, audiences to stick up, listen for very long periods.
Yeah.
Now, after all, in late antiquity, there weren't other things to distract them. So this was their, as it were, their television. This was their their form of entertainment, you could even say.
Thank you.
So I think that is probably why you have these.
Thank you, Susan, for your question. Ryan?
Thank you, Armando, for organizing this, and thank you, Malfino Brock. I was wondering, do we have a sense of what the intellectual formation of St. Jacob, what it might have been like, and particularly was there an ascetic, did it take place in an ascetic context?
We know that he attended the school in Edessa, the famous Persian school, and the theological bent of that school at that time was very much in the tradition of Theodore of Mopsuestia. And Narsai was director of the school, possibly when Jacob was there. We simply don't know. And the chronology of all this is very uncertain. Now, what we do know is from Jacob's exegesis that he must have picked up some of the exegetical ideas that you actually find in Theodore. Doesn't always use them in the same sort of way, but he benefited in that sense. What was the exact syllabus at the Persian school, we simply don't know. And even less than we know about the school of Nisibis, where we do know a certain amount. But for the Persian school in Edessa, it's remarkably little. So it's really anyone's guesswork. You have a few allusions to, well, very few allusions to classical antiquity in his poems, I think. Unlike some other Syriac writers, you have references to pagan cults, the homily on the fall of the idols. Quite often, actually, you do have references to known deities of the sort of pre-Christian Aramaic culture of Syria, Mesopotamia. You'll find that, I think, in the homily on Edessa and Jerusalem. So that's you have to deduce what he learnt from what he produced, and maybe one can find a lot more, but I personally haven't tried. So not a very good answer, I'm afraid. So stimulus to others to try and find out more.
Thank you, Ryan, for your question. George?
Yes, and thank you again for all of you for putting this together. Kind of three small things here. First of all, you mentioned a little bit about the 5 physical senses versus the 5 spiritual senses. I was just curious, is that pretty much the inverse of the physical, perhaps, or is there another insight that is shared in the writings? That was question 1. Question 2, I just wanted to know, when you were reading the excerpt on Christ sleeping on the cross, just where could we find that particular excerpt? I just would like to know that. And then when you mentioned the 3 anaphoras that are possibly contributed to Jacob of Serugh, do we have those readily available to read or see? You mentioned the baptism one is very much contributed to him. So those were my 3 questions.
Yes, so going backwards, and you'll probably have to remind me of the first one. The 3 anaphoras are now very conveniently available in a volume of large number of Syrian Orthodox anaphoras edited by Father Bebe Varghese in India, simply called Syriac anaphoras. And he has, I think he has all 3 of those anaphoras. So that's the easiest place to find them. And it's got an odd translation on facing pages. The official publication is in the Rome series, Anaphorae Syriacae, and that has a Latin translation. I think it's in volume 2, but offhand, I'm not quite sure. So that's the last one. The quotation, I was reading from, let me see, Symposium Syriacum 1976. So that's the second Syriac symposium and my contribution to that. But where the poem came from, 27, it's in Bejan, volume 2, page 589.
What was the first name of that? The
Symposium Syriacum. This is the collection of international colloquia on Syriac studies, which started off in Rome in 1972 and goes every 4 years. And the next one is in fact in Paris, delayed from last year to this year.
And then the first question was just about the 5 physical senses versus the 5
yes,
spiritual
of course,
senses.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, I think in most Syriac writers, you will have not always an equal balance between the physical and the spiritual, but they certainly don't neglect either of those, or certainly the physical doesn't get neglected. So the body is very important, even in monastic writers like Isaac. But for Jacob, he will often have the 2 pairs, as it were, the 2 levels of interpretation of the biblical text. You've got the physical level and then the spiritual level. And the 5 senses, this seems to be quite well developed. The 5 spiritual senses, it's well known from Greek writers, from slightly earlier Greek writers, but it's well known in Syriac writers, certainly from Jacob's time onwards. So he's not introducing anything very new here. So just make sure that if you speak in the body, don't think that that's where you end. And if you're speaking of spiritual ones, don't think that the body is not important.
Thank you, George. Case?
Hey, Sebastian, it's good to see you so well. It's been a long time. Case and Wiesen here. Actually, my wife Kirsten has a question for you.
Yes, I'm wondering, Sebastian, if you've reflected or thought about why these authors, more Ephrem and Jacob, were particularly sensitive to...
Sorry, could you speak up a bit? I'm a bit deaf now.
Okay, I'm wondering if you've reflected on why these authors, what made these authors sensitive to the female condition? Why do you think they were so much in touch with the female?
I think that's very difficult to answer. I really can't tell you. I think it's just the makeup of the individuals concerned. Some people feel empathy and some people feel less so. I really don't know how to answer that, but it's clear from their writings that above all Ephrem, but also to a lesser extent Jacob, did have this feeling. Whereas if you contrast, say, with Narsai, contemporary poet, or one of the Isaacs of Antioch, you won't find anything really at all similar. So I don't know how to answer your question. It's a very good question, but maybe someone else can answer it for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christian Wiesen and his wife. David?
Dr. Brock, thank you for all your years of bringing Syriac thought to the English-speaking world. I have one quick question. Do you feel there is a common heritage between the Syriac Christian poets and the rabbinical writers of the Talmud?
Certainly they came from a common earlier Aramaic heritage. I think the links between the Syriac tradition and the Jewish tradition, at least by the time of Jacob, would be more in the area of liturgical poetry. Now, Jacob is probably more or less contemporary with Yanai, who is one of the earliest Hebrew poets who survive. And in fact, there's a very nice verse of Yanai on Tamar, Genesis 38, where he puts in a very epigrammatic form exactly what Jacob is saying in a very long mimre form. So I think it's in the area of poetry, earlier Aramaic poetry too, in the Palestinian Aramaic poetry, for which we've only got small snippets left, often connected with the Palestinian Targum tradition. There you'll find that this is clearly a common heritage. Now in the Talmud, I found it more difficult to find well, any close parallels. There certainly are parables in some of the narrative parts, more Hegelic parts. You will find elements which remind one of hagiography, that sort of thing. But the more halakhic side, well, I think that sort of legal approach is something that you find much later in the Syriac tradition, and I suppose beginning with Jacob of Edessa, who was a great canonist, and then especially in the medieval canonical collections. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, I'm afraid, but that's how I see it.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have time for 3 more people to ask questions. More Polycarpus?
Yes. Taudi Sagi Malfono Sebastian Brock for excellent presentation. My question is about the educational aspect of Jacob of Serugh. A few years ago, I heard from Professor Samuel Rubenson, a pastor from Norway, studied under you, about Jacob of Serugh. And he adapted some of his homilies for educational use in the schools in Norway. Can you tell us more about this? Was he successful, and how did he manage to adapt these for the educational theological purposes for the school in Norway?
Thank you, Saidna. I don't actually know about this example myself, but I can well imagine how Jacob could be very nicely adapted. The way he retells the biblical narrative, I think, is often quite dramatic. Maybe one could cut out specific passages if one's, say, a teacher's dealing with a specific episode in the biblical text, have some examples, for example, of the speeches of what that Jacob introduces. I think with a bit of imagination, one can make use of it without having, as it were, imposing the whole mimro on the students. So it's a matter of, as it were, adapting Jacob to the particular age group you've got, maybe as it were, retelling Jacob in different terms. So having Jacob's invented speeches of biblical characters, as well, brought them up, bringing them up today in a more colloquial style or something like that. I can see all sorts of nice possibilities. So I very much hope that use would be made of him. I think he's such a marvelous writer, so inventive and so instructive in many ways, and so enlightening.
Totally. Thank you.
Thank you. Colby?
Thank you, Armando. Good to see you, by the way.
Good to see you too.
I wanted to speak a little bit about the question that Kirsten Beeson's wife put forward about women, and she was asking about Jacob Serugh, and Brock talked about Ephrem. And I would like to say a few things about Ephrem. I have a distinct feeling, and I probably would like to write an article on this someday, that Ephrem was involved in ministry directly with the women. I wrote my dissertation on the homilies on reproof, and women are prominent in those. And Ephrem seems to have very personal knowledge of the types of struggles women are going through in his church. and he speaks directly to those. And I think we see that as little subtle asides throughout his Madroshe, that there's that he has direct pastoral responsibilities with the women in his church. And I think through that and through his empathy, we see a developing care and concern for women. Or I can't say we see a developing care because we don't really know the order of things.
Right.
And I mean, it's all something we would have to tease out, but I do think that Ephrem is directly involved in the care of women. I don't really have much more to add on that at this point. I don't see that in Jacob of Serugh. I don't see that there's as a direct interaction hasn't struck me the way it has with
Yes.
with
I think you're
Ephrem.
absolutely right, but it's very interesting what you say. I'm intrigued by your mention of these homilies on reproof, admonition, because it might be an indication that one or two of them are genuine, because most of these, it's a very popular genre, and many things get attributed to Ephrem, and most of the ones that I've read tend to be rather male oriented. And so if you've got some that are rather different in character, that might be a good indication that they're genuine. So it's one of the small arguments. One would need a lot of other information to sort of support this, but any bit of evidence is worthwhile. So worth pursuing. Very interesting. Thank you.
I agree with Beck's assessment that the first three are authentic, that he publishes in volume 1, and then he publishes a fourth one in volume 2 that he puts heavy doubt on, and I agree with that heavy doubt. I think that the first three are found in 2 manuscripts in Dar al-Suran that you've cataloged, and those perhaps are also authentic since they're grouped with these other 3 that are considered to be authentic as well.
Yes, well, I'm quite keen on seeing the one on the sinful woman of Luke 7 in volume 2. I think that has a good possibility of genuine, but that of course has been disputed. But I find it very difficult to know how to prove these things one way or another.
Yeah,
and you can prove something that's definitely not Ephrem if there's sort of language that only comes into use much later, but it's very difficult to prove positive.
Yeah, one of the things I think about of authenticity is anything that we can see in his style, somebody else could have seen and replicated. And
yes,
so
very dangerous area.
Thank you, Kobe. Last but not least, question from Dana.
Sebastian, hello. Long
Hello,
time.
lovely to see you.
Likewise. Very quick question. Can you think of parallels to Jacob's, as you called it, criticism of the analytic approach to Christian belief? And in particular, I'm thinking about his use of wonder. And I'll remind you that Aristotle says the beginning of philosophy is wonder, which might have settled.
He would have liked that.
He would have liked that. He could have been aware of it, actually, right? So I was wondering if there are parallels that you can think of to this approach, to some criticism of the analytic approach to belief.
He very rarely has any criticism of any depth, one can say. He quite often has these, as it were, asides showing his disapproval of that approach, but I don't think he ever sort of engages head on, and he wouldn't want to. He just says, that's not the way I like. I prefer this third way. And even in his homily against the Council of Chalcedon, which I think is probably genuine. He doesn't deal with the problems, the Christological problems there at all. His disapproval of it is really its divisiveness. So that's what he's really sad about, and that's what comes out in that homily. But he's not, as it were, engaging with the wrong approach as he sees it. He's simply saying, I prefer a different approach, and this is my approach. And he sticks to it.
Okay, thanks. And hello to Helen. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Wonderful to see you again.
Likewise.
Sebastian, thank you very much for this wonderful talk and for taking more time than the allotted time to answer all the questions. I thank all the participants, and I remind you that our next meeting will be Wednesday, February 17th at 10 o'clock Washington, D.C. time, and our presenter will be Philip Fornes. I look forward to seeing all of you. Thank you again very much, and hope to see you soon.
And thank you all for listening.
دحلو فايميت وتحاسب